Hi, everyone. For those who have joined on early, we are live, but we are still just working out some kinks behind the scenes on how to live stream this to YouTube. For those who were not able to register for the keynote, please let them know that the keynote will be live on the OSPI YouTube page, and you can send them this link that is projected on the PowerPoint that they can use to view it all. They won't receive clock hours, but they will still be able to get all the content. And if anyone is not able to see it today, the recording will be available on May 4th with closed captioning. Please feel free to send any questions to the Q&A, and we will have our facilitator help with those. Oh, and please subscribe to the OSPI YouTube page. If we hit 10,000 subscribers, we get real-time closed captioning.
Morning, George. Why don't we go ahead and test your audio?
I'm on. Is that okay?
It sounds great. It sounds perfect.
And I assume you can see everything too, right?
I have a lovely backdrop that I see behind you.
Yeah. Thanks to Robin or Shiloh, whoever that was that taught me how to do that.
All right, we'll get started in a little less than 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna turn everything off and just hang out.
Sounds great.
Hi, Justin. If you can go ahead and screen share your PowerPoint, I'm going to give you the reins for everything.
Good morning. If there's anyone monitoring, I'd love for you to check my sound levels here and tell me if you're picking up construction sounds outside my window.
Good morning, Chris. This is Tony. Sounds good. I'm not hearing anything from the background.
Okay, great. I'll go back on mute.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Poulos. I'm the MTSS Director at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction in Washington. I want to thank you for joining us today. We're glad that you're here with us. As we're all becoming more proficient with distance learning these days, we ask for your grace today should we run into any broadcasting issues. If something happens that we're unable, unable or uncomfortable resuming any of our streaming sessions, we'll record the session and post it online within the next couple weeks. If you'd like to share your learning on Twitter today, you can use the hashtag MTSS Fest 2020. Thank you. So as we get started, I want to share with you and recognize that we have people from all over Washington, as well as from across the country joining us today. But for those of us in the Olympia area, we acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Squaxin Island tribe, descendants of the maritime people who lived and prospered along the shores of the southernmost inlets of the Salish Sea for untold centuries. We ask that participants of this meeting honor the tribal lands on which each of you are located today, within Washington, on the lands of tribes located on the coast, to the tribes on the Central Plateau, to those along the Columbia, Spokane, and other rivers, and to those living in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. We ask the same of you wherever you might be watching in other parts of the country. We acknowledge the commitment of all Pacific Northwest tribes to the resurgence of their traditional ways and their respect and protection of all people, not only those who are living, but also those who have gone before and who are yet to be born. We pay our respects to the elders, both past and present, and to the valued resource the tribes have defined as their children. They are the tribe's future. As you read OSPI's vision, mission, and values, I want to ground us in the work that we're doing, and that emphasize that we view MTSS as a means to support the whole child, close achievement gaps, and ensure every child gets what they need when they need it. A special thank you this morning to our friends at the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, the UW Smart Center, and Kaiser Permanente. They have all donated time and resources to make today's event possible, so thank you to all of them. And in just a few minutes, I have the privilege of introducing our State Superintendent, Chris Reykdal, and our keynote speaker, George Sugai. Both have been tremendous leaders before as well as throughout this COVID crisis we're in. But before we begin, let me take just a couple minutes to share with you a little bit about our day and about this event. Our agenda today looks like this. We'll be together this morning until about 10 o'clock. We've tried to be intentional about ensuring break times throughout the day to get you up and moving, to take care of your homes, your students, your children, and yourselves. We shortened the sessions that we originally had for our face-to-face event from 75 minutes to 60 minutes, just to accommodate some of the needs to get up and move from our computers. To attend any of the sessions that we have scheduled, you'll need to have registered for Zoom. If you did not register, or if you are hoping to hear more than one session, don't worry, we'll record all of the sessions today, and we'll be posting them to the OSPI MTSS webpage. We anticipate having everything posted around May 4th to provide time to close caption everything before posting. Sessions today, we'll have 6 sessions happening at the same time this morning at 10:30, and then we'll do another 6 sessions at 1 o'clock this afternoon. And you can see here what sessions we are offering. Again, to access these via Zoom, they'll not be streamed on YouTube, but if you wish to view them, if you haven't registered and you wish to view them online, they will be online in just a couple weeks. So normally we walk into an event like this, we see the crowds, we see the people, we see the venue, and it's energizing. And obviously that's not the case today. So let me share a little bit with you about who's here. I know we just met, you'll just have to take my word for it because you can't see everyone. But we had 1,000 people sign up for today's event on Zoom in one day. Those 1,000 people represented 115 Washington school districts, as well as our friends and partners to the right and more. When we saw the interest, we decided to stream the event on YouTube. Right now we have almost 200 people also on YouTube and are expecting that to increase even as we go this morning. So we're excited that you're joining us, and a little breakdown of who's here by role, and this is of the 1,000 that registered on Zoom. We have about a quarter of you are principals, welcome. You're followed by teachers and directors, and then our student services staff, so and coaches and university people. So thank you all. We are glad you're here. As we get started this morning, I want you to really think about what to do with the information you hear throughout the day, not just this morning, but throughout any of your sessions, regardless of the content. And what we want you to think about is how you're going to take this back to your team. You've heard it said, MTSS is a team sport. That's a concept Dr. Sugai will reinforce with us this morning. And we recognize that there's challenges right now in collaborating with your teams. We recognize you're not able to get together in a room and sit down and talk through your learning together, but we do want you to be really intentional about finding a time online or whatever that may need to be to think about what did you learn, what do you want to do with that new information, that knowledge, the needs that you heard, and then think about how you, as you're action planning, think about how you're going to build the capacity of your team so that they can provide training and coaching to the staff throughout the buildings, throughout your district, to be able to engage in this work. And then throughout all of that, we want you to be really thinking about how you're getting feedback, how you're communicating and getting feedback from your staff, your families, and your students. This is a collective effort. We need all of us to do it, to work together to accomplish it. So really be intentional about what you're going to do with this information after today. Time permitting this morning, Dr. Sugai has agreed to take questions. So throughout the keynote, I will be monitoring the Q&A section. You should have something that kind of looks like what's on my screen, little button that says Q&A. If you type in questions that you would like Dr. Sugai to answer, I'll keep track of those throughout the keynote. And then towards the end, as we have time, I will read those to him and he can answer to all of us real time. What I'm going to try to do is kind of group questions by similar content, and then we'll prioritize those to try to get as many people's questions answered as we possibly can. So with that, I have the pleasure of introducing our state superintendent, Chris Reykdal. Superintendent Reykdal's leadership has been tremendous in guiding our state and focusing on the whole child and equity throughout our educational systems for many years. He has been working tirelessly to provide guidance to all of us from the home to the classroom to OSPI over these last several months, especially. We're extremely grateful for that. He says he's been losing some hair over this. I'm not sure I feel terrible about that for him, but we are so glad that he is here with us. So please join me to welcome Superintendent Chris Reykdal.
I really appreciate it, Justin. I love the hair comment, but as evidence from the picture to now.
You are muted.
Oh, let me know when you're ready. Are we doing okay? I'm gonna need a thumbs up or a sound back on that. All right. Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for being a part of MTSS Fest. Best laid plans, right? Nobody thought in a very long time we would find ourselves in the moment that we are in now. But we are here. And as resilient folks, we work hard to make sure we have the capacity as professionals to support our students. So pretty rarely that we get to live such trauma, quite frankly, and battle it ourselves and then try to build teams to help our students through it. But this is pretty real world. If you pick up any construction noise outside my window, I assure you the one project in the state that will still be going 100 years from now, that started now, is the dig a hole, fill a hole, dig a hole 16 times outside of the OSPI building. It's been phenomenal to watch. And I'm grateful that there's some folks out there getting work done, but it's pretty loud sometimes. So hopefully you don't pick up too much of that. This is a moment unlike any other. Our systems are obviously a little bit challenged right now. You have been building capacity in most of your districts for several years now around multi-tiered systems of support. You've gone through professional development, many of you, to first get the concept, begin to build norms around the expectation in your districts or buildings. You've done professional development around the component parts of that. And we're seeing a nice transformation in districts where they're starting to really put all those pieces together. But most of that framework was built in a time when we had traditional models of relationships and data exchange and the ability to really connect real time with kids and to build a schedule about it that is a traditional one in face-to-face environments. So this is a new layer that adds additional challenge. The word new normal keeps being used, and it was used in part to kind of describe this contemplation today. It is both a challenge for us to think about how we, I think, come out of this smarter, not just about technology and connectivity and hardware, but it sure magnifies the inequities of a system that depends on kids having connectivity. It magnifies a system that has historically told itself that for 6 hours a day in a building, kids get basic education, but we know darn well we've been pushing lots of that learning and lots of that expectation and lots of that connectivity to additional engagement in the home. And that's not always a safe place for kids, and they're not always connected at home. They don't always have supports that they need at home. So I'm taking from a lot of this that the systems you're building right now are being built with fidelity around both a return to our traditional instructional model and our support model in our buildings, but a much more sophisticated and humble understanding of how the world of technology, the expectation of connectivity to learning outside of our buildings, how inequitable it has always been and getting worse. It's not defined as basic ed, most of these services that we provide now outside of our building, and yet we essentially demand students to be engaged in that. On the academic side, for example, if you want to engage in your high school and beyond plan, that's increasingly online. If you want to be in a Google Classroom or a Microsoft Teams environment, you need connectivity. Most students are checking grades online. They're connecting with teachers at times at a distance. Academically, we've built a dependence on technology, and it simply isn't equitable out there. To the non-academic side of things, when we think about students' mental health and the growing sense of isolation of a lot of our young people, I actually think technology plays into that a lot, but there's a lot of other factors as well. There's a growing pressure for our young people in the environments they face when they go home, whether it's that sort of constant pressure of peers and social networks or the fundamental lack of supports that they might get in our schools. So you all come at this from a different professional development track, but you're in teams building multi-tiered systems. And I think right now, there's never been a better example of how we have to integrate all those systems and think holistically about the success of our students. I would also say that while it is a challenge for all of us to think about coming back, it is really important that you develop game plans that are both timely and diverse. So if we can come back face to face, I don't think there's a scenario where we're not doing some sort of social distancing for a while. And that probably means smaller teams and a harder time actually connecting in small groups. A lot of you have built strategies around student engagement in peer groups and or peer educators. You're going to have to be super creative on how the continuity of that work moves forward in an environment where maybe you can't keep the connection. So we're all figuring out these tools, but we're going to have to keep learning them with even greater success down the road. I think there's a scenario where we don't quite get to come back. Again, the default plan right now and everything I've heard from the governor is we are coming back face to face, and he's going to start next week unlocking pieces of our economy and allowing more and more of that. But I do know that large gatherings and the density of students in schools, so we pack a lot of kids in schools. Those are high risk categories that tend to be further down his thinking in terms of the safety of a return. So we're modeling and starting to model a return to our buildings in a socially distanced, safe way, and a lot more capacity for learning at a distance. It's challenging because it magnifies the urgency of your work as you build MTSS systems, because you're kind of parallel planning for what a return looks like and the real supports kids need academically and socially emotional. And you're building a parallel platform for how unique it might be if more of our kids are at home. So I want you to imagine, and there's certainly no decisions about this, but as the governor's thinking through it, one of the contemplations is it's really K-8 that needs a lot more support, both because developmentally where they are, and because childcare is a absolutely fundamental and complicated American phenomenon where we watch our children in school while they're learning rich content, while they're developing as young people, so that parents can largely engage in the labor market. So there's some consideration of what if we tried a more intense face-to-face environment for our K-8 students, but if we can't come back fully face-to-face, we put a lot more of the dependency for independent learning and at-home learning on our high school students. Well, those are really different systems of MTSS. One really builds upon a more of a traditional face-to-face model, a more intensity of supports with adults interacting directly with students. It's more real-time engagement. But our high school students need a lot of this work and benefit as well. And there's a scenario where they are more disproportionately out of our buildings next year. So a lot of models being considered. We're going to start pouring through all those. We've had to get through some really tough guidance already, and we'll keep trying to make really deliberative decisions with the best information we have, feeding the governor what we can about it. But he is growing more and more aware of the complexity of our system, that it's not just a delivery system for content, but maybe more importantly, it's a delivery system of support for kids, and particularly those most vulnerable to income inequality, to racial injustice, to language barrier, to disability. We are getting his team, I think, a little smarter about how holistic and complex our system is. And it's not just about can we return to learning or not, it's how do we support families in traditional models and now with this more extended distance opportunity. So I want to thank you all for still engaging. It's pretty easy to throw our hands up right now and check out, and yet that has not been my observation of anyone in this system right now. People are probably working too hard, and what I mean by that is in the beginning, a lot of families were flooded with opportunities for learning, and they're not trained educators, and so it was hard for them to manage a lot of that information. I hope with our continuous learning guidance, our sense of compassion and humility that we've tried to encourage in districts, and now finally kind of landing on a grading policy that is not perfect by any means, but it does create some statewide clarity and framework. My hope is we actually simplify how much goes home, and what the expectation is that it's narrower about a few critical standards and really targeted support for kids. And it's not sort of a shotgun approach and good luck everybody and grab what you can grab in learning, but being a little more intentional about our work for the next 8 weeks. But we will start to immediately pivot and think about the fall and what that looks like. And there's a ton of decisions between now and then, of course. But mostly I want to say thank you to you all, because your very role in this means you are thinking about whole child supports, and you are thinking about those academic and non-academic supports. And most importantly, I think what I've been most impressed with by all of you is your sense of how healthy, strong, and functional the adult teams need to be in order to be successful with students. And it's been a really positive thing I've observed from all this. I like you, I've spent 20 plus years in and around education, and I've seen a lot of folks ignore the development of the professional at times in order to do everything we can for kids. But the clear recognition that we need to be healthy and safe, that we need a professional climate that builds trust with each other, that we integrate our supports and services, that we really build a safety net amongst ourselves as professionals so that it can actually catch kids and support kids and allow them to climb up that ladder to big, fun, awesome slides, right? So thank you. It is great to virtually see all of you. I hope you have an incredible day. I thank you, Dr. Sugai, for your work with us today. I'm grateful that you've given up your time and your knowledge and your expertise to keep the development in Washington State. We got a pretty awesome thing going here, and a virus isn't going to stop us. That's for sure, but it causes us to do the work differently. So for me, thank you. I can't be on all day, that's for sure. I've got other Zooms, but I am grateful to all of you. Have an awesome day. Focus on your health and safety. Keep it all in perspective. This is a public health crisis first and foremost, and we're responding with an educational response for our kids. But always keep in mind together that we're battling this as a state, as a nation, as a planet. Thank you. Good luck. Dr. Sugai, once again, thank you so much for your expertise, and I wish you all the very best today. Take care.
Thank you, Superintendent Reykdal. We're very fortunate for your leadership, and we're grateful for that. So thank you much. We're going to transition over to Dr. Sugai. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity for all of us today to benefit from his knowledge and experience. As Dr. Sugai shares his experience, his knowledge, his wisdom on how we can use multi-tiered logic and leverage our multi-tiered systems to address the current and anticipated needs that we have as a result of this mental health and public health crisis that we have and are anticipating. Dr. Sugai is a former co-director of the National PBIS TA Center for 20 years. He's a professor emeritus, having retired from the University of Connecticut 357 days ago, right, Dr. Sugai?
That's absolutely right.
George's work has been published in countless books and articles. He has provided support to districts, states, and countries across the world throughout his career. He also has ties to the Pacific Northwest, and Washington in particular, having earned his master's and doctorate degrees at the University of Washington and working at the University of Oregon for a number of years. On a personal note, Dr. Sugai is an avid cyclist. He's trekked across the country on multiple occasions, and he's been spending some of his retirement time preparing to start traveling the country in 4 wheels now instead of 2. And excuse me, like all of us, I'm sure he's excited for life to be safe to travel again and to explore again. George has been providing support to me and to our team at OSPI as we are working to scale up more support to our districts and schools across the state. So please join me in welcoming Dr. George Sugai.
Thanks, Justin. Let me just do a sound check. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Great. And I assume you see the right screen, correct?
We do.
Cool. All right. So thank you, Justin. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to jump right into this pretty quickly just because of time. But I want to start out by saying this is a great opportunity for us to be able to spend some time together. I do appreciate the chance to be able to serve as sort of the warm-up band for the rest of the sessions. I really see my job as one of giving you some ideas to think about as you work as teams, as Justin indicated. Listening to Chris, I think in about 10 minutes, he covered all the main points that I'm going to cover as well. He talked about a new normal. He talked about equity. He talked about mental health. He talked about connectivity and relationships. And all of those are things that we are concerned about. And Justin and his team asked me to kind of play with those topics and think about how we can move the transition needle over towards what happens as we think about the new normal, if you will. So I'm going to jump into this pretty quickly, and I'm going to kind of start off with, again, some acknowledgements. You know, I've been in retirement for a while. I'm kind of rusty. I don't do a lot of this kind of work anymore on a regular basis, but I still have quite a strong passion for what's been happening out there. And with the recent crises, it's been pretty important, I think, for all of us to consider how we're going to move this all forward. So I really do want to acknowledge Chris and the work he's doing, Justin and his team. Again, much of what I'm going to share with you, we've kind of learned from the kids and families and others and educators out there. And I really do appreciate the fact that 1,000+ of you are spending some time with us. I understand that some of you are probably doing yoga and hand weights and doing your planks while you're watching this, and that's fine. I'm hoping that as you're doing those other activities, you'll get a few ideas to take back to your teams, or at least to take back to your school as you're thinking about getting restarted again. I am a little bit out of practice, if you will, with some of this content, so I just give you a little disclaimer up front. And I also am pretty new at the Zoom stuff. However, Justin's teams taught me how to do a better background than my basement. So I'm appreciative of the fact that I can put a different background in place. And I do really want to acknowledge the co-presenters, because they really have the main job of giving the details of some of the big ideas I want to cover as we go through the morning. First of all, so let me tell you what I was asked to do and what I'm going to try to accomplish. And I think the big words that I want to stay with are this notion of MTSS as being a foundation, if you will, or a logic, as Justin mentioned, or as a starting place for how we think about supporting our kids. I'm going to make a case that it's not something new. I'm going to make a case that it's something that will serve as a great foundation or starting point for how we think about the transition into this, quote, new normal. I'm going to argue that the MTSS Foundation is going to serve hopefully as a way to make decision-making, implementation, evaluation, and so forth more efficient for us. I'm really concerned that when we come back, we're going to be trying to do too much. I'm really concerned that we're going to be bumping into each other as we do our work. And I really think the MTSS framework serves as a means by which we can clean that up a little bit and hopefully accomplish the kind of outcomes that are important to us around the academic, social, and behavioral success of our kids. I also want to suggest that I'm going to try to answer 3 questions. Part of this is going to be kind of boring, and so that's when you can do your planks. And that is, what is MTSS? So I'm going to argue that there's plenty of good definitions out there, but I'm going to suggest that there are some essential features that you really have to kind of give emphasis to if this is going to work. Now, the second question I'm going to try to answer is how this MTSS framework can serve as a way, as Chris mentioned, to increase the quality of our engagements with our kids, with our families, and with each other, so that proactive, positive relationships are established that will allow us to be able to achieve the outcomes that Chris talked about on the academic, social, and behavioral side. And the last thing I'll do for a few minutes at the end is spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about what we've learned about action planning and how teams can use their minutes, use their capacity, resources to schedule activities in a way that might be more beneficial, especially under these conditions under which the playing field out there is really been upset or disrupted, and in which the routines and so forth may not work in the same way as they have in the past. As Justin indicated, there'll be some time for Q&A, either at the end of the presentation or through a follow-up that Justin will kind of take care of. So I'm just giving you that heads up, because sometimes I tend to go up to the time that I'm supposed to finish, and I may not give it time for answering questions, but I'll try to do that if we can. I also want to let you know that here in Connecticut and Massachusetts, the pollen is coming out. And so if I rub my nose and so forth, you can't catch it because we're on Zoom, but and I'm not sick, I don't think, with COVID, but I am sniffling a little bit because of the allergies. All right. So I have 3 major objectives. I'm hoping that when you walk away from this, you'll be able to tell anybody why MTSS is important, not only now, but also for the future. I'm also hope that you're going to be able to walk away with, here are some guiding principles or way to do our business so that we can be more effective and efficient and relevant in our action planning. And the third thing is, I'm going to try to give you some vocabulary, some concepts that will allow you to go to the sessions that follow this opening so that you can take full advantage of what others are going to be presenting. I'm going to focus on this notion as teams is where the action is. And I know there are many different people out in the audience on YouTube as well as on Zoom who are listening in. I just want you to think about how you're going to use the content to either participate on a team, to help form a team, or to work with a team as the team is guiding a school through its process. So team is going to be a big deal for us. And it's, as Justin mentioned, a key feature of our teaming process or MTSS process. Okay, I teach to the test. And when Justin gives the test at the end, here are the two main essay questions. And I like to think of these two pictures as, if you remember nothing else, remember these two things. And the first one is this notion of a continuum or a logic or a tiered logic. Now, everybody probably on the call has seen triangles before and understands the importance of a continuum. I would love for you to think about the continuum as being an essential tool in your toolbox, regardless of what you do. I think of the COVID-19 challenge and how a lot of us fall into the category of having minor symptoms. Some of us have more intensive symptoms that require much more support when we're at home. And a few of us are going to require assistance that means being admitted to a hospital. And I think about the level of support that's provided along that continuum. And that same continuum logic applies to our kids, our families, and ourselves. The second big idea or essential outcome that I want you to consider as at the end of the day, as well as at the end of this opening session, is this notion of how four critical elements interact with each other in our problem solving and our team action planning. As you all know, in our traditional professional development models, we've oftentimes focused on practices, and that's what kids experience. And we say that here are the things that's most important for us to be able to get to the kids. But I'm going to argue that the MTSS logic gives equal, if not more, emphasis on being clear about what we're trying to achieve, which is the outcomes, as well as what the adults need to have to be able to select and use the practice to achieve that outcome, and also the data that are required to guide our decision making. And as Justin did at the very beginning, which I think is just absolutely awesome, is making sure that we understand the cultural context in which we are working with those four elements to put that continuum in place. So if you remember nothing else, I want you to approach problem solving and action planning with the idea that the continuum is important for guiding us and that we have four important tools to consider: outcomes, data, practices, and systems. And if you look on my ankle, these are the two tattoos that are always present, and because they're sort of fundamental to the work that we do. Oops, I forgot to show you my little pivoting prompts. So the continuum and the interaction between the four elements. Now, a lot of the language out there in the bigger world is about this notion of a new normal. And I think that new normal idea makes sense. But I want to argue that you just can't think about what the new normal is going to look like or might look like and just only prepare for what we're going to do after the COVID-19 event is happening. I'm going to suggest to you in the MTSS logic that we need to be thinking about what we're going to do now, what we're going to be need to be doing during the transition process, as well as what we're going to do after. Those three time periods are probably sort of critical to the MTSS, not only the development of the action planning, but getting people ready for the action planning. And I might even argue that the before part is the most important, because you want to get people ready for being able to move into the actions that are in your planning. Now, I'm going to go off task just for a second. On the right-hand side there, you'll see a little hand clap, and I forgot to mention it earlier. I think there was one on the previous slide as well. That little hand clap means put your hand weights down, something important's happening. And if you want to pay attention to anything, pay attention to the content that has a hand clap by it, because those are the things that I think are sort of really important. And the really important part of this picture is this notion about what are we going to do now in March and April? How are we going to move into the during part, which goes over the summer and as we approach the fall? And what are we going to do after the kids come and we've gotten started? And how long is that after going to last? Okay, so let me ask you to think about the context for what we're covering for this thing called the new normal. And I'm not going to go through all the words on this picture, but I think it's important to understand that what people like Justin and myself and others and Chris have been doing, and yourselves as well, has been trying to create environments where kids and adults and families can be successful. And you've been dealing with issues around opportunity gaps, around bullying, around school violence, around mental illness. We have been working on those things for many, many years, trying to create environments where kids can be successful, where families will be comfortable, and adults can do the work that needs to be done. I want us to think carefully that that's an important baseline for which we can do our next steps. It's not that we give up on what we've done, but we really need to expand and enhance what we do well in the context of what's coming up. Unfortunately, COVID-19 hit. It caused some really significant crises involving critical illness, involving chronic illness. People who are being affected are going to have long-term effects. Many of us on this call have experienced people who have been critically ill. Some of you, unfortunately, may have experienced death in your families. Some of you have experienced significant disruptions of your relatives and friends with respect to employment. And some of you have experienced pretty significant trauma yourselves because of what's going on. What that really argues for is being very careful about thinking that this transition is not just a new normal. It's a new normal that means that we have to pay attention to the T word, that word called trauma, because we're going to have more unemployment. We have unemployment now. We're going to have to suffer the effects of that unemployment. We've got homelessness that's going to increase. We've got all those kind of things that have always been around, but now we know the impact of those things and the presence of them are going to be much more in our face as we think about moving into the new normal, if you will. I want to create some optimism and say we do have some tools and some things we've learned from that baseline phase, but we can't be just kind of nonchalant about saying we're going to do a little bit more of those things. We're probably going to have to adapt some to that. And that new normal means we're going to have to calibrate and renovate. It's not like just putting new furniture into our house. We're probably going to have to break down some walls and restructure some of the hallways and pathways within our homes. Education in particular is going to be important to us because that's our kind of domain. But schools are one thing that kids rely upon and families rely upon, not only for the social support, but for the academic successes that they experience. We know that the things outside the school are also going to be different. And around mental health, around public assistance, around insurance, what recreation is going to look like, and how the federal and state leaderships are going to function. All of those variables contribute to a new normal that's not just amping up a little bit. It's more about being strategic about how we recalibrate and renovate what we're doing in order for the school organization to function more effectively. So the hand clap here is, and I heard this someplace and I can't remember where I heard it, so I apologize for not having a reference, but this new normal isn't about just turning on the light again. In our case, the light switch is broken. And what that means is we're going to have to think about, replacing that switch, and it may have to be a different kind of switch. And it may mean more than one switch. And I think that notion of, come back after Christmas, turn the light switch back on, isn't going to be the same as this transition that we're confronting because it's systemic and community-wide. So a little plug here, and I'm going to kind of focus. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know that there's a couple of sessions on it and there's lots of resources out there. But I want us to think about the MTSS logic as a way to bring the trauma-informed approach into our schools so that kids can experience this notion of being supported when they come into these environments. There's a really good start for this. And in March 26th in the Washington Post, Valerie Strauss, who's somebody I kind of follow, has done a really good job kind of making a case for how important it is for us to amp up, if you will, our focus on trauma-informed approaches. That is already happening in some places like the SCL work and like the PBIS work and other contexts and the violence prevention work. And I'm going to suggest to you that's going to be something we need to step back and bring into what we're currently doing. In that particular article that Valerie put in place, she references tolerance.org, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that site if you haven't already. The tolerance.org site is supported by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they do a great job of sort of summarizing how we need to approach the trauma-informed approach. And again, I'm not going to go through the items, but when you look at the materials which are available to download at the OPI site, they kind of highlight 4, 5, 6 things that are important to the trauma-informed approach. This notion of creating predictable routines and about maximizing safety through engagements and relationships and so forth. I really, really want to push that if we're going to do the trauma-informed approach well, we've got to do number 4, which is we've got to consider all kids, all families, all staff members, and we've got to do it from an MTSS perspective. So what does trauma-informed experience look like for everybody in the school? What does that trauma-informed experience look like for those kids who might have experienced trauma more directly themselves and are still struggling for how to figure it out? And how do we support those few kids who might have directly been affected themselves personally by something within their family, within their cohort of friends, where it has had a dramatic effect? Same thing is true of families, and same thing is true of staff members. We can't assume that all staff members are going to come back ready to hit the ground rolling. Fortunately, most will, but some are going to need a little bit of time to make the adjustment, and some are going to need a little bit more collegial support in order for that transition to occur. And we need to make that overt, and we need to formalize our approach to that. And lastly, all of us on this call are going to have to model these things that we're asking other people to do. Because if we don't model it ourselves, it's going to be very difficult for the environment to accept the changes that are required. Now, I'm going to stop just for a second. Justin, is everything sounding okay and working okay visually?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. Any comments you have before I go on? Any questions you think I should address?
No, we'll save we have a couple, but we'll save them towards the end for now.
Okay, I'm going to check back with you every once in a while, make sure I'm just not talking into the space someplace.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Good. I also want to point out 3 or 4 resources that are available at the PBIS site. Now, I know this is a general MTSS Fest conversation, but at the same time, my kind of roots are in the PBIS world. And I want to suggest that the PBIS site has some good MTSS materials. And there are 4 that were recently created by the site or posted at the site, some guidelines that address some of the topics that I'm going to cover today, and also going to be covered in more depth in some of the other sessions. And some of them have to do with families, some have to do with how to teach routines at home, and others have to do with responding to the COVID crisis specifically. So I'll have you kind of reference those yourselves, and there's a hand clap there to kind of remind you that it's important. I know you have lots of time for some spare reading because you're at home. If you haven't had a chance to look at this book called The Nurture Effect, and you're kind of academically oriented, this book does a really nice job of kind of helping us think about why human behavior and the environment that we work in and science-based approaches are so important. It was written before the pandemic, but the concepts, the logic applies even more so now as we think about our transition. So I just give that to you as a final resource. Okay, given that little setup, in the next 46 minutes that I have, I want to move on a little bit to focus on some kind of theoretical, conceptual, important pieces to how this logic makes sense around MTSS. And then I'm going to shift over to a little bit around teaming, and then I'm going to end with a couple of examples. So that's sort of my next 3 major steps, if you will. I'm going to do a piece of just a real quick summary of some research that was done in 2000 with a cohort of kids from 2015 that was recently reported in 2018. And I just want you to come away with a couple of big ideas from 2 sub-studies from a national survey. I've used this a couple of times in some other presentations. Some of you probably have read this yourselves, but I want to summarize 2 or 3 big important points that are important to our transition into the new normal, as well as our thinking about the MTSS logic. And don't worry about the graphs, don't worry about all the words, don't worry about the numbers, just focus on that red circle. And in the first study, our first analysis, they interviewed teenagers, and they asked them the question about, how safe do they feel at school? And the message was really kind of cool. And what they said was, school is one of the safest places we experience. 95% of the students reported feeling safe at school. across the country. And that is regardless of the perception of crime in the community. That's an important context comment, because what it means is that you could live in a high crime, high violent, high antisocial community and still feel like safe school, safe place. You can live in a neighborhood where you don't have those challenges, and you'll still consider school as being a safe place. And that's still in the context of the violence that's occurring inside of schools, which frankly is fairly rare, but it's pretty traumatic. Schools are a safe place. Now, the reason that's important to us today is because kids are coming back to school. They rely upon us as a place where they can learn, feel safe, be able to engage us socially and so forth without feeling threatened. That is an important context for us to do the work that we're going to be addressing within the MTSS logic. That same study indicated that kids are more likely to feel safe at school. Of the 95% of kids who felt safe at school, most of them said, I feel safe at school because I have access to an adult or a friend. Now, what I want you to walk away with here is that notion that adults are important and meaningful people to kids. As we come back to the new normal, as we go back and build our teaming efforts, the whole process is about getting kids access to adults and getting access to their friends and building those relationships, because that relationship creates a sense of safety, which creates a context for us to be able to support kids along the continuum. So to go backwards, the study has two messages. Kids feel schools are safe, and two, they feel safe because of us and their friends. We have to take advantage of that. We have to build that as our context for the work that we do. Second small study that comes out of that same survey, same kind of picture, graphs and numbers and so forth, words. Here's what I want you to think about from the second sub-study. What they found in the kids 12 to 18 years old is that there has been a decrease in the number of reported bullying and hate-related words by kids 12 to 18 up until 2015, right? So it's important messages. 2015, decreases in bullying. That is a good thing that there are decreases in bullying. There are two things to consider. We don't have data after 2016, and we don't have data after 2019. Now, the reason I bring those two dates up is because between 2016 and 2018, the FBI reports and other reports indicate that bullying rates and hate-related activities and incidences have gone up. I'll show you a little data for that in a second. And in 2019, 2020, the initial data suggests that there's an increased amount of bullying, hate-related words now going on around the COVID-19 impact, around immigration, around people who are Asian Americans, around. We know that there's the context of crisis and trauma creates these tensions that cause kids and others to engage in interactions with others because of some preconceived kinds of notions. So it's pretty important that we understand that, yes, it looks like the bullying events have gone down, but we should not assume that those same trends are in place after 2016 or after 2019. What does that mean for people like me and for you? Our efforts for MTSS have to keep in mind that we have to create school climates in which the social emotional learning supports for kids are such that we consider the likelihood that bullying might be a problem. We've also found that between 2007 and 2015, the kids who reported decreasing incidents of bullying, they said there were decreasing reports of decreasing bullying incidences in places where they also said there were more contact with adults and with kids. Say it another way, when kids and adults have access to other adults, they're less likely to find or see bullying inside those schools. Saying it again, adults are significant others in the impact of decreasing bullying incidences or preventing it or inhibiting it. We, the adults, have a really important role to play, and the MTSS framework in my logic is going to be, we've got to formalize our role in developing those relationships. And that's going to be one of the messages that this MTSS logic is going to make sure that we help with. Now, I don't know what's happening after 2016, and I don't know what's happening after 2019. So it's going to, again, be pretty important for us to keep those in mind as we move this forward. But I think the data prior to that are pretty compelling about safety, bullying, and adults in these particular times. So here's another way to look at the same kind of issue. And I want you to think about, again, this sort of public health logic that we're moving into right now. Yes, we are reacting to COVID-19, but it's still a prevention problem. And we want to think about prevention in the context of how do we prevent this from escalating any further, but also in the sense of how do we support kids so they can be more successful in the future. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because it's pretty logical. It's easy to kind of understand, but there's a couple of points I want to make after we kind of walk through this. The basic idea here is that every kid, every family member, every staff member tends to have direct or indirect experience to some risk factor that most of us are able to handle and deal with. And we deal with it because there are protective factors in place. Kids who are academically successful, kids who have good social skills, kids who have good healthy habits, etc., tend to be able to handle some of those things that most of us are struggling with on a daily basis. However, COVID-19 showed up. And when COVID-19 showed up, we found that there were significant enhancers of those risk factors. Kids were being traumatically affected. We've got negative modeling going on in our social media. Families are disrupted, discrimination is going on, the list goes on. So when COVID-19 hit, it's an example of a risk enhancer, meaning that something happened to cause those relatively minor risks previously for most of us to become much more significant to more of us. And if you're a kid or a family member with significant risk already, these have even more dramatic effect upon us. Now, the reason I wanted to go walk through this kind of public health model is to be aware of two things. One is when crises like COVID-19 show up, we tend to react to the problem, and we jump quickly to a range of interventions and solutions. We jump quickly, sometimes to punishment, sometimes to exclusion, sometimes to biased kinds of responses. We jump to one-time training events. We try to find quick solutions. We jump to things that actually have more deadly effects than they have enhanced effects because the studies haven't been done. And we use a lot of subjective decision-making. I want us to be very, very careful that as we move the transition into the new normal, that we're cautious about those ineffective responses. There are many things out there that make us feel good, but we may not have the minutes, the time, the resources, because they compete with us being able to do the good work. Now, just to give you kind of in a way inappropriate on my side set of examples, you know, when school shooting events occurred, many thousands of people came to schools to help them. There was this reaction of how can I help you? And lots of interventions were being introduced to schools, more than the schools could handle. And yes, it's well-intentioned, but many of those interventions did not have good experimental or even sometimes educational validity for being introduced into the schools. We're going to have the same issue when COVID-19 new normal is being addressed. Many people are going to want to help. The team's job is going to be to make sure they have a good filter in place so that they are making sure that they are making good choices on what they're going to do within their action planning. So my warning for you to consider, and maybe that you've already figured it out, and that's great, is be very, very careful of the reactive response to a crisis. Know that those reactive responses are natural because of the risk enhancers, and that our job as a team is to be very strategic about filtering out what is ineffective, time-consuming, competing with what we might consider effective practices. We know, for example, that trauma-informed decision-making is an effective, evidence-based, you gotta do it approach. We should not let trauma-informed interventions be watered down because it's being competing with something else that might sound good, but doesn't have the support for it. We know that one-shot in services are very ineffective as a way to respond to crisis events. So that means that professional development needs to be ongoing. It needs to be embedded within the school routines, and it needs to be carefully coached. and it needs to be provided on it along a continuum for all versus some versus few. So I leave those for you to consider as you walk forward in trying to do your action planning. Stay with trauma informed, focus on prevention, use the tiered logic, use information to guide your decision making, do ongoing continuous professional development, focus on high fidelity implementation of a few things and do it well. And lastly, and I'm going to put a little star by this one, make sure that you have leadership that is proactive, engaged, and participating and competent in this process. It's really easy for leadership to talk on high levels without actually helping implementers be able to feel supported in the process. And the leadership process, not just being individual leaders, but teams as leaders also. And I'll go back to the comment earlier about how important it is to model what you are asking other people to do. Back up a second. So I would emphasize on that list on the right-hand side, this notion about MTSS as a basic logic and staying very true to the trauma-informed approach in trying to organize what we do. Okay, having said all those kind of nasty things, what I want us to think about is we on this call, we on this YouTube, we on this Zoom, whatever you call that, is we are in an incredible position to have a big impact on facilitating the transition into the new normal. I have always argued that schools are one of the best social change agents we have in our communities. Kids are with us for 12 or more years. We have them 180 days a year. We have them 6 hours a day. There's no way that online learning at home, distance learning, is going to compete with 6 hours a day, 180 days a year. We know that schools are a place where kids can feel safe and they can have a trusting relationship with adults. So we, as on this call, we as action team builders, action plan builders for our teams, need to say to ourselves, how do we make sure that we take those 6 hours per day and we organize it in a way that's efficient and effective and relevant for our kids and ourselves and the work that we have to do. It's not going to be about doing more in those 6 hours. It's going to be more about how we use those hours strategically. We're going to have 180 days, I hope, next year. And I hope that if we have 180 days, that we use those in a way that are cumulative and we can maximize the growth across those days. We know around that circle that those are the elements that make it possible for those 180 days to work well. Schools are places where there are professional adults who are caring. We can provide specialized supports in those environments. We have adults who model the right way, et cetera, around the circle. Schools are more available than mental health facilities are in our neighborhoods. They're more available than police stations are. So let's make sure that we created schools in a way that reinforces what we already know about being what's important in those school environments. Okay, so rehash. Big idea. You got to focus on the MTSS logic as the kind of the ladder for which we do our work. It's important to think about data, practices, outcomes, and systems as a set of tools to do this work. It is a new normal, but it's not a new normal that can be just turned on or off. We've actually got to build the new normal, and we got to build it in a strategic, efficient manner. And I really argue that schools are a wonderful place to do that, better than any other place that we have to try to build that logic. So let me do a little bit more, 5 or 10 minutes, a little bit boring, around making sure we're all on the same page, for at least in the state of Washington and those that are on the call about what MTSS is and isn't. And then I'm going to focus on some teaming things, and then we'll kind of close out my part. The big idea here is that MTSS is not a big deal. The MTSS logic has been around with us since 1970s. It got its kind of jump start in the RTI movement. The PBIS Center kind of built the MTS logic, RTI logic at the time, into our work. And MTSS comes out of the prevention world. It's been out there for a long time from the prevention sciences. So, you know, what we're actually doing now is saying, you know, maybe we should be doing that within our schools. The big message here, though, is that MTSS is not an intervention that kids experience directly. MTSS is a scaffolding, an approach, a process, framework, whatever you want to call it, for the adults. It's there for us. It's what we experience. It's what the team uses to organize the practices that the kids get. So I think it's pretty important that we walk away from this day making sure we understand that we're building a framework for our practices. And that framework is a continuum. And that continuum is kind of loaded, if you will, with identified empirical practices. Those practices have as critical outcomes the academic and behavioral success of kids. And MTSS is for all students. It's not just for a few. Sometimes there's a myth out there or a misrule that MTSS is only for the kids who run away and are cause us problems. No, MTSS is for all kids. There's a misrule that MTSS is only for general education. That's not true. MTSS is for all kids. Kids with disabilities, kids with mental health issues, kids who are doing fine, etc. So it's important to kind of keep in mind that it's a general logic for us to be able to do the work that's being done. My rule at PBIS, some of you on the call are PBISers, need to understand that if you are already doing PBIS, you can build upon that history or that experience to expand the MTSS logic out into other areas of the school. So think about not abandoning your PBIS team, but instead saying, how can we renovate our PBIS team to become part of our MTSS leadership within our school or district or county? Now, don't pay attention to the words, just say, oh my gosh, there's a lot of them. Lots of definitions out there for what MTSS is. School psych has them, every state has their own definition. You in the state of Washington have your own definition. I like to use as a starting point a general definition that Kent McIntosh and Steve Goodman have been using in their book on multi-tiered systems. The book has been out since 2016, and there's been a lot of kind of rehashing and refinements, but it does a good job saying, you know, MTSS is not an intervention. It's the way how we organize what we do inside of schools. And the idea is to create one coherent system that allows us to go across the domains within the school. And, you know, I think it's the big idea here is that to understand that you are building a framework, and it's not something that we're going to try to put in place for the kids directly. Just another kind of picture to reinforce this idea. I want you to think about the MTS logic, as Justin kind of suggested, as being this umbrella for everything else that we do within our schools. Some of these words are probably familiar to you because you've experienced them within your schools. Some of you are in states that have used some of this language. But the idea, again, is to have you keep in mind that it's just kind of an umbrella, that all of those kind of programs or projects that are underneath the MTSS umbrella all share the same features. And PBIS is my world. I'm not going to read this at all. Just go to the Washington OPI site or OSPI site, because you've done a really good job already of creating a general kind of parameters about how MTSS framework is going to be developed in the state of Washington. Now, hand clap. There are lots of variations for what MTSS might look like within a school or a county or a district, but they all tend to share some common functions. And what I mean by functions, I mean actions or activities. A good MTSS team at the district level uses data to guide their decisions. A good MTSS team spends time trying to build local capacity for implementation at the school level. A good MTSS team places a priority on evidence-based practices and puts them into a continuum, and so forth around the circle. When you walk away from this day, I want you to go back and say, gee, we need to set up an MTS team. We need to bring members onto the team. The team members need to understand, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do these things. We're going to use data. We're going to screen regularly. We're going to coordinate implementation as a team, you know, and so forth and so on. These are sort of the core features. You can add some others. You could probably de-emphasize some of these things, but these are common across all those definitions I just shared with you. Again, I'll come back to the idea that whatever that logic is, you're always going to be focusing on the kind of outcomes, data, systems, and practices. They're all represented in those core features as well. Okay, I'm going to slow down just for a second. I know I've used this before many, many times. I'm going to use it one more time just to remind you. For those of you who haven't heard this presentation before, I want you to pay attention to this notion about what a continuum is. I want to start out by showing this picture primarily because it kind of gives us an idea about what we don't want to do inside our school environments. So it goes like this. Here's a picture of a sign in a neighborhood. And this particular sign has been set up because all the buildings around the school, on the street, have graffiti on them. So the neighbors got together and they put this sign up to inhibit graffiti writing. And what do you see on the sign? You see graffiti. And what's interesting about this picture is the meaning behind it, which means the following. They put up a sign to inhibit graffiti writing, and what shows up on the sign is more graffiti. We have an intervention that was put in place, but it had no effect on the kids who are doing the graffiti writing. And you could argue, and I would agree with you, that the sign inhibits the wannabe graffiti writers, the kids who haven't developed a repertoire of graffiti writing yet. It's not a habit for them yet, but they're not going to be affected by this. They are affected by the sign, and they're going to put their spray cans away. There's some kids out there who are thinking about becoming graffiti writers, and they see the sign and they don't do it because they have enough experience with their with the rule that they're not going to be doing it. But the hardcore graffiti writers don't even pay attention to the sign. Now, so let's go fast forward. Why is this important? To acknowledge that there's a mismatch between the intervention and the problem you're trying to solve. You're trying to get the graffiti writers not to write, but you put up a sign to inhibit the new graffiti writers. So we have a mismatch. In every one of the schools in the state of Washington, you have the functional equivalent of the graffiti hotline sign, and that's the discipline handbook, right? And or the reading basic, the basal reading program, or the math curriculum, or the science curriculum. You have a graffiti hotline equivalent. What I mean by that, using the discipline handbook as the example, is that you have a set of rules that tells all kids inside the schools what they should not do and what the consequences are going to be. Most kids don't even know the handbook exists because they already have the social skills for success. Some kids have to experience the consequences and they will stop doing this behavior because they just need to be reminded of the social skills they need to use. And there are some kids who get 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 30 office referrals because the discipline handbook does not work for them. Many of the schools we work in use the discipline handbook as their only means for which to create, quote, a positive disciplined classroom, school-wide climate. And what's important about the message is that that is insufficient. It's a one-dimensional intervention. We need to create a continuum of interventions. That's where we come into play. And that's why the three-tiered logic is such a big deal. The discipline handbook, the graffiti hotline sign, is that bracket on the left-hand side of the triangle. All kids are in the triangle. All staff members are in the triangle. All adults, educators are in the triangle. We need to have supports in place for everyone, but we need to acknowledge that some are going to need a little extra and a few are going to need something more intense. Now, you'll see a hand clap there, and the hand clap is saying the continuum is represented by this three-tiered logic. Keyword is logic. There's no truth to three tiers. It's a way of organizing the continuum. Why did we use three tiers? Because that's what the public health model is built around. The truth probably is that it's more like a continuum. Oops, let me back up. That those lines don't exist, and that in fact, they're going to crisscross around it. And I'll kind of give you an example at the very end. What I want you to kind of think about here is that throughout the United States, if you Google triangle, PBIS or anything else, you're going to come up with thousands, literally thousands of triangles. I couldn't put them all on the screen, but this is what the range of kind of examples you're going to get of what the triangle might look like. And what I want you to remember is that logic of three tiers is represented by most of those, but was probably more helpful to us is to think about the continuum as literally a blended continuum. And that blended continuum says there's no hard line between the tiers. That in fact, the hard line is going to vary depending upon high school versus preschool versus alternative school versus juvenile correctional school versus, and so forth. And it's also going to vary by classrooms as well. What's really important about the logic here, though, is that if you do all well, you're going to have fewer kids who require attention for more intensive supports at the top. What's also important about this picture is you'll notice that the arrow on the left-hand side gets bigger as you go to the top of the triangle. And that's because the supports for the few is more intensive. So the logic here is that you got to make sure that everybody is being supported with something that's very efficient, because you have to direct the resources towards those kids who need a little extra. And that's true of reading, that's true of math, that's true of behavior, that's true of physics, that's true of music. You know, you can teach in one way to most and they're going to get it, but somebody is probably going to need a little extra tutoring, and some kids are going to need a change in the curriculum in order for that to be successful for them. So it's really is a continuum. Now, before I leave the triangle stuff, I want you to also remember that we don't label kids by tiers. We think about kids as having some strengths and some needs. And the triangle logic helps us organize that. So here's a kid. She has 2 areas for which she's getting one-on-one intensive supports. She has a few areas for which she's getting some peer tutoring in the middle, writing Spanish. And she has a few areas at the bottom for which she needs no help. Is she a tier 3 kid? The answer is no. Is she a tier 1 kid? The answer is no. Does she get tier 3 supports? Yes, for math and science, but she's not a tier 3 kid. Here's a kid in special ed. He has an IEP for anger management and problem solving. He's got 2 objectives written for those areas, goals for those areas, but he does some other things pretty well. He works with technology. Sometimes he needs a reminder. So he has some other areas for which he has no need for supports. What that picture means is that special ed, because you're a kid with disability, does not mean you're a special tier 3 kid. What it means is that you have areas for which you need tier 3 supports, but you can still participate in tier 1 because you're doing some of the things that are really important for us. Special ed is not a tier 3 intervention for tier 3 kids. Special ed is a service delivery model and a due process system by which kids get greater access or free and appropriate access to areas for which they have needs because of a disability. Pretty important messages for us to remember. I want to finish this kind of logic or example with what a triangle might look like for me. So this is my picture for my strengths and needs. You know, I used to do some work in Jamaica, and they speak patois there. It's a kind of a dialect, and I need somebody standing right next to me. I need one-on-one translator to understand patois and to be able to engage in a conversation. In my work group that I used to run, I needed a group of individuals to help me calculate the statistics for doing a hierarchy for an HLM, or being able to calculate a significance quotient. I needed help with those things because I can't do it myself. And there are some areas for which I need to know help. You know, cooking, billiards, lawn mowing, etc. I don't need assistance. Now, my wife might say I don't express my emotions enough, and then I need counseling for that. But that doesn't make me a tier 3 husband. What it does say to me, there are some areas I need to work on. And that area does require sometimes tier 2 or tier 3 supports, but I'm not a tier 3 husband. I am a person who has some strengths. I mow the lawn, I go on long bicycle rides to get away from out of the house and so forth. And I think it's really important to understand that we as adults have similar triangles as our kids do. It's not that we get defined by our triangle per se, by the tiers. We get defined by that range of experience, that things that we have. Now, everybody on the call, you have a homework assignment, and that is to fill out your own triangle for yourselves. As you approach the process of building a team, what are the things you do really well in team building? What are some things you really do well with team action planning? What are some things you do not so well when you're participating in a team? Kind of outline for yourselves the areas for which you know that you might need some assistance to be a good team member, or a good teacher, or a good whatever. I want us to think about the fact that all of us on this call have some areas for which we're really good at, and some areas for which we could use some assistance. And that will help us, I think, being able to be better team players in the process of doing the teamwork. So again, summarize, we start off with 3 triangles as sort of a logic. The truth is, it's probably a blended kind of continuum. We don't label kids. We focus on what they can and can't do, and those can and can't do's become our student outcomes. Inside classrooms, we can organize our classroom management practices along that same continuum. If I was a classroom teacher and I was teaching my biology class and for 10th graders, I would want to do all those things at the bottom with all 25 of my kids. For some kids, I might need to do some small group work or provide peer mentoring. And some kids, I might have to build behavioral contracts. Inside my classroom, I can still build the same continuum. I am applying the MTSS logic to my classroom. Same thing as school-wide. Those of you that are on the call, I think there's something like 35.7% of you are school administrators, principals. Inside your school, instead of having a single school discipline handbook, you should be having a continuum of behavioral supports for all kids inside your school, all 1,200 of them or all 75 of them. What are you going to do for all kids inside your school? What are you going to do for those kids who need some group-based support from a counselor? And what are you going to do for those kids who need high intensity supports? And those of you who are asking what CBT stands for, it's cognitive behavioral therapies. And what goes into the triangle, I want you to know two things. One is that's what this school selected or their team selected. And I also want you to notice that they picked a few things to do well. The idea is not to fill it up with as many things as possible. The idea is to fill it up with things from which you can defend and that you can implement, especially over the long term. Okay, and I'm hoping that districts develop similar continuum for how they provide supports to the teams within their schools. And those are going to be linked to some of the priorities around violence or attendance, around reading or literacy or whatever, and thinking about how they can build the supports that can help the teams implement at the next level. Okay, so just a quick little summary here, and I just don't pay attention to the numbers, just focus on the colors. And what I want you to notice is that my colleague Rob Horner did an analysis of some of the data we have at our PBIS center. And what he found is that if you do, in my world of PBIS, if you do tier 1 well, 84% of the kids are going to be pretty successful, right? And this study was done with 3,000 elementary schools and about 880 middle schools and 400 high schools from across the country. 84% of those kids are going to do fine with tier 1. And that leaves 15% of the kids needing something extra. Now, what Rob learned, though, is that if you take the number of behavioral incidences displayed by those kids, percent of kids on the left-hand side, you find that they engage in a whole lot of misbehavior. Say it another way, 84% of the kids displayed 39% of the problem behaviors. 16% of the kids that were needed tier 2 and tier 3 supports contributed to 79% of the challenging behavior. That's why we've got to make sure that tier 1 is working well in our MTSS logic, because it allows us to direct our efforts where the need is greatest, which is tier 2 and tier 3. We cannot do the supports for high needs kids when we don't have tier 1 in place. Why is this important logic for us now? Because as we make the transition into COVID-19, we're going to have kids walking in with greater risk, which means they're not going to be able to experience school in the same way that they experienced school when they left it before the COVID-19. And that means that that number of kids needing more support for tier 2 and tier 3 are going to be greater probably, and we're going to need to revamp what tier 1 looks like. And I'm going to address that in a second. So that's why we've got to be more specific about the outcomes for those kids who have greater need. We've got to collect data more specifically for students with high risk. We've got to pick the best interventions that have the likelihood of the biggest effect for those kids with greatest needs. And we need to make sure that the adult systems are in place so that we can implement those practices based on the data to achieve those outcomes. So this picture represents what I started out with 2 big ideas, the continuum and the 4 tools. So the 4 tools are the outcomes, data, practice, and systems. We need to intensify those as we move up the continuum. This is really important because as we move into COVID-19, that means that the intensities of what tier 1 look like in our implementation are going to have to be strategically addressed. The effort goes up as you go up the continuum. And that means we've got to increase the intensity, which means we've also got to pay attention to tier 1. Okay, pass this by just because of time. You can look at it later. So a little bit on teaming before I close out here in the last 10 minutes or so. And looks like we're probably gonna have you send your questions through the chat Q&A, and Justin will kind of answer those questions or send them on to Chris or somebody. So here's the teaming thing I want you to think about. If we're gonna help kids become competent, we can't just do one-shot in surfaces. We can't do more, we can't do train and hope. It's gonna require more than that. It's gonna be require that we make sure that we pick the best evidence-based practice for which we can guarantee that the outcomes are going to be achieved if we implement fidelity. So to improve outcomes, you got to pick the right intervention. To pick the right intervention to be implemented with fidelity, the teachers, the therapists, the counselors, the paraprofessionals, the playground monitors, they have to have a relationship with those kids. In order for a high fidelity evidence-based practice to have the effect that we want, the teachers and the kids have to have relationships with each other, teachers and kids. In order for that relationship to be established, that means we, the adults, have to have regular engagements with our kids. Now go back to those first studies I talked about earlier. We talked about safety, we talked about decreasing bullying, we talked about relationships, talked about the need of adults, we talked about safety. In order for us to achieve the outcomes we want, we've got to have the best interventions, we've got to build upon the relationships that are there, and we need to make sure that we build those relationships by engaging in kids. When those kids show up in the fall, we can't assume that having showed up is going to be sufficient for us to deliver the interventions. We've actually got to spend a little bit of time reestablishing those relationships by engaging them. And that goes back to where we are today, which is we've got to make sure that we organize our implementation so it ensures increased engagement, ensures development of those relationships, ensures high fidelity implementation of the practice in order for us to achieve those outcomes or that competence at the end. So that complicates what professional development looks like. It's not just saying do this. It's about organizing the environment so these engagements, relationships, and the implementations is more likely. I'm going to pass this back out to time. Go with me. So implementation means we've got to make sure we pick the best and we implement it with the greatest degree of fidelity. I know some of you have seen this picture before, but Dean Fixon and Karen Blasi gave it to me. It's the most wonderful way of kind of helping people understand why it's so important to invest in the most effective and implement it with the greatest degree of efficiency. The way I like to think about this is, are you willing to bet your next month's salary on the decision that you make? The goal is to avoid these other circles, these other places. Let me use this as an example. This is an example of an intervention, very effective intervention. We know that when you use condoms, you're less likely you're more likely to be able to prevent pregnancies. But if you present the condom stapled to the card, it's unlikely to have the effect that it's intended. So here's an effective intervention poorly implemented. We can do trauma-informed interventions because they're evidence-based, but if we don't do them with fidelity, they lose their impact. The other two are the things I warned you about earlier, which is let's be very cautious that we react to the COVID-19 crisis with jumping too quickly to interventions because they sound good. These are two examples of interventions for which, one, I don't know why you have them in the first place. And when they implement them, they actually make the problem worse. Because if you look carefully, there are little nick marks on the signs from stones being thrown. Or to finish off this picture, here's an example of, if you read the kind of the marquee, it says psychic fair canceled due to unforeseen circumstances. You really got to question the intervention when the intervention doesn't solve the problem that caused the intervention to be pulled away in the first place. Okay, so action planning. I'm gonna slow down just for a second because this is what I want you to think about as you're moving into the sessions that follow. And this is what I want you to think about as you're starting to build your action plan. I want us to make sure that in your action plan, you're considering the when question, which is what I mentioned earlier. What are we gonna do today, right today? What are we gonna do before the kids show up? What are we gonna do when the kids are there? And what are we gonna do for after? Let's formalize those routines and plans. Second, I know that many of you came to this fest thinking, what are we gonna do with kids? But I want us to remember it's what are we gonna do for our colleagues who show up on that first day? And what are we gonna do for our family members? And lastly, it's about the continuum. What are we gonna do for everybody, some and few? This is just an example. I'd love for you to think about your action planning along these domains. On the left-hand side is just a schedule. Now, 1 month, 1 week before, and so forth. It just as a snapshot, excuse me. What are we gonna do for these target audiences? All, some, and few. This picture just represents that previous picture, which shows time, target, and tiers. I won't go through some guidelines, but when you pick up the materials, each of those will have some suggestions for how to think about the before, think and how to kind of prioritize the scheduling. There's also some things about how to think about what to do for the students, families, and educators. And then also some examples of how to think about what I mentioned earlier about engagements and relationships and so forth and implementation as to what you might fill into those cells. I know this could be a little intimidating, but your idea here is what's the smallest number of things you can do that has the biggest effect that you would put into each of those cells. Pass this by just because a little bit of time. Pass that by too. So your job, I think, is to engage in activities for the now, before, during, and after that creates these school climates, these school organizations that have 4 critical features in them. One is there's a common vision about why we're doing this and where we're trying to head. There's a common language by which you're doing your MTSS process. There are a set of experiences that all kids, family members, and staff members engage in to create that vision as that's expressed through the language. And you have quality leadership through the team and your principals and coaching that allows us to be able to manage the implementation. Successful organizations have this common vision, common language, common experience, common leadership. I would love to be able to visit your school 1 week into your school year and see that most of your staff, your kids, and your family members know what the school's about, vision, have a language by which they do their business, language, and how they have a set of routines and experiences that define how school operates. And you have a leadership that's guiding the process that's more direct and engaged. All right, so one more picture that I want to share, one more thing I want to share with you, and you'll see some suggestions that are very much like everything I shared with you before. But I want us to kind of end with this example at the end. I'm kind of pass these by because I'm not using my time well. And that is this picture. And I want you to think about the interventions that you select as being ones that can be expanded or elaborated so that you don't have to say that intervention didn't work, let's do something else. Or that intervention didn't work, or that kid, what can we do differently for that student? What different curriculum or whatever. And I'm gonna use it through an example. And I'm using an example because I think it's so cool. And it's so cool in the following way, and I'll do it really the fast way. Clay Cook and his team did this great study. And it's one of the first studies out there that have demonstrated that greeting kids at the classroom door has an effect. And 2 major outcomes of a study that he did of teachers who greeted kids at the door and teachers who didn't. Going quickly to the results. He found that when teachers greeted kids at the door with positive greeting at the door, the kids were more likely to get on task faster. And second of all, there were fewer weird disruptive behaviors. So 2 messages: greet the kids at the door, academic engagement increases, disruptive behavior decreases. He did 3 things in that intervention. He said teachers give a personal greeting, give a reminder or pre-correction or a prompt, and then reinforce the heck out of it. So it's something like, good morning, Justin, air 5, because you can't touch, right? Good morning, Justin. Good to see you. I see you got your homework. Don't forget to put it in the box. Please hang up your backpack. Nice to see you today. That's a cool backpack that you're bringing to school. If you greet every single kid with just a hello, good morning, elbow bump, whatever, a little bit of reminder, get to your seat. Let's get started with a positive day. You'll have those two impacts. If you greet all 30 of your kids, 24 of them are going to do fine. Some of those kids might need a double air high five. Some of those kids, you might have to say, where are you going to put your backpack? They're going to have to tell you back. And some of those kids are going to have to, a couple of those kids are going to have to stand next to you, and you have 24 other kids give air 5s to that one kid. That was a quick example of a tier 1 intervention for all 30 kids, but some kids got a little extra at the door, and some kids got something more intensive by standing next to the teacher. We adapted a tier 1 intervention for tier 2 and for tier 3. Think about, some of you know about check and check out or check and connect. Check and check out is an intervention we use for a small group of kids who are having some challenge. It's been traditionally called a tier 2 intervention. But inside tier 2, we might have a kid who it doesn't work for. So we might make a modification for that one kid that's more intensive. Instead of a check-in 3 times a day, he checks in 6 times a day. So we turn it into a tier 3 intervention by intensifying it. The big message is, as we think about interventions, think about how they can be renovated in order to increase the reach for kids who need a little extra. We don't have to add on more interventions if a current intervention can be modified that has the same effect. As you think about your action planning, I want you to think about that positive greeting at the door as an example of how can we do this for all our staff, for some of our staff, for a few, in a way that modifies, so we don't have to create something that's uniquely different, that requires a different level of attention. All right, so let me conclude. There are a couple other slides I went through. There's some materials there that you can read on your own. You've got enough background now. I think you can figure it all out. I think the sessions will cover some of it as well. Hand clap, big idea, concluding main points. Put down your hand weights just for a second. Continuum is a big idea as you do your action planning, as you select interventions, as you think about the kids who need support. I want you to make kid benefit as your #1 critical criterion for success. When you pick an intervention, you're going to ask, what's it going to look like at the kid level? If you put together an intervention plan, a professional development plan, ask yourself, how likely is this going to reach the kid? The kid is the critical variable in this whole thing. And that's particularly true if you're a county team or for state team, because you get more distant from the kid. Use your data for guiding your decisions. Make sure you're using the smallest number of the most effective doable interventions, practices. Organize the system so you can maximize the likelihood of implementation fidelity. And remember, we're doing this for everybody. Remember the 2 big ideas represented by all those conclusions are those 2 things I started out with. It's the picture of the triangle and it's those 4 tools. That's where we want to end up at the end of the day. You being comfortable with how to manipulate those 2 big ideas. And I want to conclude now by saying, you've got an incredible opportunity to move this stuff forward. Please use your minutes and your decisions efficiently. Think about the smallest thing you can do to have the biggest effect. Organize that in a way that has the biggest impact across all members of your community. I really am pleased that you all came to this event, and I really want to thank you very, very much for everything you do. And I really want to applaud the presenters who follow me, because now I hope that they can kind of sidestep some of the basics and jump right to the big ideas. So with that, I thank you very much. I'm going to go have lunch because I'm on a different time zone. I'm going to turn it back to Justin.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Sugai. We have a number of questions and we are not ignoring those. What we do want to do is, first I want to respond to one that we've gotten quite a bit, and that is the slides will be posted on the site where you registered for the webinar, which is the OSPI MTSS page under agenda and registration. So we'll put the slides there. Anyone can download them from there. And then we also have a list of the questions. So what I'm hoping, George, if you're good with this, is we can send you some of those questions for a written response, and then we'll post those responses to the same place as the slides on the website. So again, not ignoring the questions, we'll get to as many as we can, but we also want to recognize everyone's time right now as we transition, have a little break, stretch, take care of our kids before our next sessions at 10:30. So with that, just many, many thanks to you, George. We benefit greatly every time we hear from you and learn from you, and we really appreciate you being willing to take the time to support us, to teach us, and to set the stage for the rest of the day. So again, thank you. And to everyone that is on, thank you for joining us. We will begin our breakout sessions in about 25 minutes. And if you're registered for those, hopefully you have a link from your email to those, and you should get one for the afternoon sessions an hour before the session starts. So with that, thank you, everyone. We will conclude our webinar at this point.